Hello, and welcome to Fasken's 13th consecutive mining series. Today's session is the fourth of 9 sessions, which will continue until Tuesday, March 7th. My name is Virginia Schweitzer, and I'm a member of the Fasken Global Mining Group, as well as a partner and the co-managing partner of the Ottawa office. I'm thrilled to be your moderator for today's program, ESG, Addressing Diversity and Inclusive Sustainability for Resource Companies. Welcome to everyone in the room today and all of you online. For those attending online, please refer to the slide on your screen for some housekeeping items. Issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, have become imperative to address long-term corporate sustainability. There are a number of considerations that organizations need to manage, from increased focus on social justice, expectations of talent, to stakeholder activism. Today, our panel will discuss the implications of these considerations for Canadian and international resource companies, and start to unpack some of the complexities that arise from these issues. I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. JP Gladu is a prominent Indigenous business leader, currently serving as principal of Mokwateh on the board of several major organizations, including Suncor, Institute for Corporate Directors, Broaden Mining, and the First Nations Major Projects Coalition Advisory Centre. Previously, he was president and CEO of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business and on the board of Ontario Power Generation, among others. In addition to his corporate roles, JP is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and served as Chancellor of St. Paul's University College, Waterloo, from 2017 to 2020. JP is a sought-after public speaker, both nationally and internationally, sharing insights into the challenges and successes of Indigenous business and the growth of Indigenous economy within Canada today. He is also the chair of Canada's Forest Trust and the Boreal Leadership Champions, as well as a member of BHP's International Forum for Corporate Responsibility Committee. On my far left, we have Kevin Chan, Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer at PwC Canada. Prior to this role, Kevin was the National Mining Leader at PwC Canada. Kevin has over 24 years of experience providing Canadian corporate and cross-border tax services, including cross-border financing, corporate reorganizations, corporate compliance, and tax audit defense, to large and medium-sized multinational companies across multiple industries, among mining, including mining, oil and gas, renewable energy, retail, and consumer. And last, but certainly not least, my colleague Sandeep Tatla, Fasken's Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer. Sandeep works with the firm's leadership to develop and implement a strategy that further solidifies a culture of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Fasken. A catalyst for change, Sandeep is a forward-thinking executive leader with demonstrated experience successfully leading diversity, equity, and inclusion change strategies across different and complex industries. And that's our panel today. I'm now going to turn things over to our panelists so they can tell you in their own words about themselves. I always think that's the best way to get to know people, and how they've made diversity and inclusive sustainability priorities within their organizations. Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Virginia. And first of all, thank you to Fasken's for the invitation today. As Virginia mentioned, I play a number of roles. I'm a tax partner by day. I've led our mining practice for the last 4 years, and more recently came into the role of Chief I&D Officer. And it was an interesting transition because, two passions of mine being the mining industry, something I've worked in for my entire career, and really seeing the opportunity that we as a firm had to really build a sustainable organization at PwC through inclusion and diversity. And so it's been an amazing journey. I was chatting with Sandeep earlier about how it's a really challenging area, because coming from the world of tax, where, and probably like a lot of the lawyers in the room, you have a piece of legislation and you just got to find the answer. EDI is a whole different area where everyone is on a different journey, and I think you have to meet people where they are. And so certainly in this industry, with all of the challenges, but all of the opportunities that it faces, we really see EDI as a really important focus. So I'm really happy to have this conversation today.
Thanks so much. Sandeep, maybe I'll have you go next.
Sure. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'll just give a bit of additional context of my background, and it tells you sort of how EDI has also evolved. So I started my career as a labor, employment, human rights lawyer, and I saw that there was an opportunity at that point to support some of the clients I was working with on broader issues that they were facing that were resulting in whether it's litigation or human rights issues. And so taking that opportunity, I thought, let's help these companies not get into the trouble that they're getting in it. So if you think about it, I started my career kind of from a compliance risk perspective. And that was over 15 years ago. And so what I've seen over the 15 years that I've been in this space is EDI has evolved from sort of being the nice or the right thing to do, or actually it probably started with more of a compliance piece. If you think about the different legislations that have existed over the times, affirmative action, employment equity, but then moved to, okay, it was the nice thing to do or the right thing to do, to what we've heard, as the business case for diversity. And I think we're at a place now where, as Virginia pointed out, there's an imperative for organizations to address these issues for their long-term sustainability. So, here at Fasken, we have understood that there is a strong, I would say EDI is foundational to us actually achieving our mission, and that's been baked into not only our EDI strategy, but our firm strategy. And when I talk about that, that means it's been integrated into how we do our business, from our talent and how we make sure that everyone at the firm has an equal opportunity to excel and succeed, to how we work with our clients, ensuring that we're helping them achieve their EDI goals, to also supporting and making sure that we're also supporting them with diverse teams, to community and how we engage with the different communities in which we operate to ensure that we're helping to advance EDI. And then finally, I'd add, making sure that we're not only looking at EDI within the firm, but also within the legal profession, which we know that there's some good opportunity to do. So you can see it's really been integrated into all of sort of how we do our work.
Thanks so much, Sandeep.
Good morning. Really great to be here, Virginia, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat. And actually, Toronto is home to Indigenous people from around the country, including the Inuit and the Métis. And it's a really incredible melange, I would say, of Indigenous people in this country and from the country in this city. I think it boasts around 80,000 unofficially. That's actually quite transitory with regards to many Indigenous people coming through Toronto for services, et cetera, from northern communities and all over the place. Yesterday I was on the ice, snowmobiling and fishing. I'm a hunter. I live on my reserve in Northern Ontario, and I'm not a lawyer, so I apologize if that's a letdown for many of you in the audience here today. As my bio suggests, I've been working on Indigenous issues for over 30 years now, and it's a passion. Being Anishinaabe myself and a significant land user, the intersection of, particularly around PDAC and mining in our communities, is becoming a very important relationship. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is an incredibly important topic in this country. And I would, we've had some pre-conversations, and, the Indigenous relationship in this country has been evolving for quite a few years. And I'd say in the last 5 years, it's really, since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, since the 215 mass grave that was found, Canada's finally woken up to the fact that there's been a neglected relationship, and that neglected relationship has resulted in a lot of conflicts in our country. And I will argue that the Indigenous relationship is an imperative one. Like you said, Sandeep, it's not a nice city anymore. If you do not get your Indigenous relationships in check, you are not going to build your projects. Or if you do, they're going to be way past budget, way over budget, and way past the timelines. And so when we think about ESG, there's an I in every letter. I have many discussions with my Indigenous colleagues around, do we create another space for ESG and I? And I push back on that, because whenever you put Indigenous in the corner, it never seems to get the resources, the political or the financial, to deal with the issues adequately. But when you think about environment, who else would you want on your side leading regulatory processes than the Indigenous people who've been on the lands for thousands of years? When you think about the social challenges in our country, the Indigenous communities, we're at the bottom rung. And many of our communities are doing extraordinarily well, and we want to continue to build on those successes across the country. And then from a governance perspective, I do a lot of governance work. And, not that we're going to start reporting every 7 generations. I don't think shareholders are going to really want that. But certainly starting to embed some of those longer term views of the way that we govern our organizations, because shareholders are expecting a lot more from our companies, and having Indigenous oversight, and particularly anything that has to do with Crown lands or our traditional territories, our shared territories, it's going to become increasingly important. So the last 5 years of my 30 years has been extraordinary, and it's becoming more complex, and I'm really happy to be here, and including the Indigenous voice wherever you can is really important for business. Thanks for having me here, Virginia.
Thanks so much, JP. We have a great panel, and so I'm going to put out some questions. I'm hoping, Sandeep, that you can perhaps set some background for our discussion today and give us your perspective on what we actually mean by diversity and inclusive sustainability, and why they do or should matter to stakeholders of companies, and particularly resource companies, given our audience today. Perhaps equally important, the unconscious bias that companies and stakeholders may have as part of that discussion.
Great. Thanks for that opportunity, Virginia. So I think I said in my intro, we've seen EDI evolve from being compliance to a nice to do. There was a discussion where you had to demonstrate the business case of diversity, and now we're at the stage where it's become an imperative. So you're hearing the word imperative. And the reason for that is actually because of the stakeholders that organizations work with are actually demanding that organizations deal with that. And the reason that and I'm going to go through sort of why they're actually demanding that. It's not just social activism that's drawing this out, but there's some data to support that organizations that actually manage EDI effectively are outperforming those organizations that do not. So starting, I'll share some stats. There was a Gartner research done 2021 now, and where they asked Fortune 500s the top material issues that they're facing. EDI was number 3, and it only came behind climate change and business ethics. Behind EDI was talent management, broader ESG, and other issues. And so you can see if those are, and these are Fortune 500 companies from across industry and across geographies. So it is something that CEOs are thinking about, that organizations are thinking about, that boards are thinking about specifically. And the reason, like I said, is because these issues are important to the key stakeholders that organizations are engaging with. The most obvious one I think that we can appreciate is talent. And so I've got some sort of stats to share with you around talent expectations, but we've started to see talent expectations change. And I've said I've been doing this work for a long time. When I first started out, we were talking about the looming talent shortage. And here we are at the talent shortage. We're also in a place where we've got millennials and now Gen Zers and entering our workforce, and their expectations around what work is, what organizations do, especially around the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion is important. They've got high expectations around that. And that's largely due to their own experience, their lived experience. Many of them have grown up in the Me Too era, era, we've just seen sort of a social reckoning with race over the last number of years, and that's their social context. So if I look at, I'm going to share a stat here because I find stats are important to help us understand. In some research done, and this is research that comes from, the stats I'm going to share come from a number of different organizations, whether it's McKinsey, BCG, the Center for Talent Innovation, and actually there's a stat from PwC's own research. So 86% of people want to see a more equitable and sustainable world after the pandemic. 80% of consumers say companies need to recognize their role in systemic racial inequity. And on that sort of point, what I'd say is consumers are expecting organizations to deal with this. I think we've gone beyond the days of statements and platitudes to these issues. Some of you may know that there are active investors who are bringing claims when corporations are not standing true on their claims that they're making or their commitments that they're sharing. And actually, I was at a session last year with the London Stock Exchange where we had a number of corporations and investors in conversation. And what I heard is that the kinds of questions, and you may have already seen this in your own worlds, but the kinds of questions that investors are now asking on EDI have moved away from just what is your representation, how many women do you have sort of in senior leadership, to starting to ask questions about, can you tell us what your attrition rates are for different demographic groups? Can you tell us what programs you have where you're developing certain groups and what are the outcomes of that? So, investors are becoming more savvy because they recognize that diversity does lead to better performance. And that'll take me to the stats around performance. What we know is from the research is that if you are managing diversity, equity, and inclusion well, and that means you've got diversity, so you've got different faces, different experiences around the table, but also that you're creating a culture, and this is what's key, is that those people can actually show up and add value to your organization in the way that others can. The research shows that those organizations, they're 70% more likely to capture new markets. They're 36% more likely to outperform on profitability. They see 19% higher innovation revenue. And the research shows that when you've got diverse and inclusive teams, you make better decisions 87% of the time. So when you look at some of the stats that I've cited in terms of performance, profitability, expectations of not only consumers, talent, and investors, I think you can understand why organizations need to look at this and why investors are actually demanding that organizations manage and effectively deal with diversity. I think there's an immediate impact to organizations' bottom line on managing these issues well. But if you think about the longer term, and this is what we talk about when we talk about sustainability, organizations that are managing these issues well and planning to manage these into the future will ultimately do better, because if you're not looking at addressing these things, you're going to have a weaker talent brand. You're going to have weaker overall performance. You're not going to see innovation that will set you up for success. The other thing I do want to talk about a little on the Indigenous front, and I think it's more broadly in how you're engaging with the communities in which you operate in. Recently at the World Economic Forum, there was discussion around, for example, on topics of climate change and other issues around how we actually engage with communities that have historically been not involved in the conversation. So whether that's the Global South or Indigenous communities, if we're not engaging with those communities, and as JP said, there's huge missed opportunity, because those are the communities that actually understand how to sustainably move forward and how you'll be able to engage and do business with those communities, again, for longer term sustainment. So I've tried to do it really quickly, and I know it seems like you got to add, so I'd love for you to add.
Yeah, no, just to add to one example, just to illustrate what you're talking about, Sandeep, around the business imperative. I was traveling last year to meet with one of my clients, and I just come into my inclusion diversity role, and I was speaking to one of the operations folks, and they were saying, they operate an open pit mine near a local community, and they were really struggling from a talent perspective to fill all of their rosters, and so they could not get full capacity going through the mill because they had open haul truck driver positions. And many of the folks in the local community, mainly the men, were working at the mine. But there was a perception from the community's perspective, particularly the women in the community, that this organization just there was sexual harassment and other types of issues happening within at the local site. And so here you have this company with excess capacity that it can't fill rosters with, and so getting the strategy right around workforce inclusion and diversity is super important. And I know organizations like the Mining Association of Canada have a draft protocol out for their towards sustainable mining framework, and one of them is around inclusive workforce. And so what they're looking to do is have organizations run internal surveys, and I think for those in the audience who are familiar with some of the surveys that have come out publicly around anti-bullying, sexual harassment, including that as part of the TSM framework, and having an independent expert come in and review those every few years. So certainly we see the needle shifting at the industry level, particularly with the MAC and other organizations really having a focus on this. So I think that's just a real example of how having an inclusive framework for, providing that environment for your employees to feel safe, psychologically safe, physically safe, can really drive better business results.
Yeah, I just had one more story to that, and it is no fun living in the North if you're not used to the North. And our communities, non-Indigenous communities as well, but we live up there. We are used to it. It's actually, we prefer to live in the North. And when we think about the expense of bringing people in away from their own communities, in and out, the added expenses when we're not capitalizing on the local northern communities, that is another huge missed opportunity. And then again, the social license that it creates, that your advocates start to become the people in the communities that are working for your company. If you get the strategy right that Kevin's talking about, that you provide safe places for women, LGBTQ plus, Indigenous, that workforce is strong. We just it's there. We just need to develop it.
Thank you so much for that, for all your commentary. I know that people in the audience are really interested in hearing your own experiences and real perspectives. JP, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to explain your perspective as a business owner, a board member, and with your Indigenous background, why diversity and inclusiveness is so critical to corporate sustainability, building on what Sandeep had mentioned before, and how resources companies should be integrating these perspectives into their business strategy to achieve sustainability, which I think you started on when you were talking earlier.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest, just building on Sandeep and Kevin's comments, one of the things that you have to, when you go anywhere, you want to see yourself reflected in the workforce. You want to see yourself reflected in the policies. There's a really amazing organization called the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. My successor, Tabitha Bull, runs it. There's this great program called the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program. There are a couple hundred companies, a lot of them resource-based companies, that builds on towards sustainable mining. It really is a framework to help companies understand how to develop reconciliation action plans, how to build a workforce, how to create safe spaces, particularly in the Indigenous community. When you bring Northern people down to the cities, there's a culture shock to it. There really is, and creating spaces for Indigenous communities to or workforce groups that can actually get together to share stories, to build support for each other. And then all the way to the top of the, if you want to call it the food chain. I mean, how many companies in this room or folks that are online have an Indigenous director on your board? I've been having these conversations with some of my fellow ICDers around making sure that anything that has to do with land, transacts land issues in this country, really need to be developing evergreen lists, need to be developing Indigenous people into those board roles, those C-suites. And there are a lot of incredible Indigenous leaders in this country with the right credentials, the right experience. And let me tell you, the young people that are coming up through the ranks are formidable. So pay attention to that wave of Indigenous leadership. And it was really interesting. I was having this it was a friendly debate, and I said, after I said, we need to have Indigenous people on boards. We need to have them at the front, as I've just explained. And I had this one woman push back. She goes, no. As long as there's a person on the board that has some, a lawyer perhaps that's got understanding of treaty issues. And I was like, well, okay, so as long as that full board of older white gentlemen, as long as they're married to somebody or has a daughter or a niece, that qualifies them to speak on part of gender issues, right? And so the kind of point stuck in, it's lived experience. It's making sure that you draw from your base who have actually been in the spaces that you're trying to impact, because there's no substitute for that lived experience. And as I've mentioned, and again, I'm kind of getting off your question, but I often do that, I'm sorry. We can talk about hunting, fishing, anything you want. But having that Indigenous voice and at the table is going to buy you a lot of social license with the communities. It's really, really important. So the things that Kevin and Sandeep are talking about, I think the more that we can execute on those strategies and targets and tracking it and attrition and making sure that we continue, because we all know in this room what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So measure the hell out of everything and make sure that you implement strategies that are going to improve your numbers.
Just on that representation of particular groups on boards, in this case, you're talking about Indigenous representation on boards. I think we have to also recognize that when you put an individual into role, they are not only able to talk about issues in JP's case, he's not only going to talk about issues related to being Indigenous. What happens when you bring that diversity into the room together, the way that they even look at other issues starts to shift, and it shifts the conversation that people are having in the room. And that number that I shared with you around increased innovation and productivity comes from that. It comes from the different conversations that you start to have in the room, because you've got people with different perspectives and lived experiences. And so that, I think, is fundamental to remember. It's that you're not bringing the Indigenous person on just to talk about Indigenous issues.
It's also about building trust at the end of the day, right? PwC ran a global CEO survey, and I think there were over 4,400 global CEOs across 89 industries. And one of the results that came back was that that CEOs felt that trust was one of the highest indicators of financial performance. And so if you don't get that right, starting with your EDI strategy, you could have challenges as an organization. And so one of the things we did at PwC Canada last year was we put together what we call our trust roadmap. And so what we did was we spent some time looking to what do our stakeholders, which includes our employees, our clients, our regulators, what do they look for from PwC when it comes to trust? And we came up with 20 KPIs that we would measure ourselves against. And to be quite honest, it didn't look great. But I think, as JP said, what gets measured gets done. And so we put some metrics out there, some targets, some aspirational targets, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable to that. And I think that's one of the things as organizations, if we can look in the mirror and say, here's maybe where we're not performing as well from an EDI perspective, from a broader trust perspective, we can't move that agenda forward and drive better business results for our organization as well as for our clients. So I think trust is at the heart of everything we do in this industry, particularly in this industry. It takes years to build trust, and it takes one safety incident, one tailings dam failure to really break that trust. So if you don't have that trust, you're not going to be sustainable as an organization.
Thank you. You've all led into my next question to Kevin, and just building on the trust map and the some of the work that PwC has done. Maybe you can talk a little bit about we've mentioned that we're seeing that more company stakeholders are looking for more than just words. Perhaps you could address the need for companies to adopt accountability frameworks and transparency, considered table stakes by many stakeholders, and also the importance of data in addressing these key issues.
Sure. So, I think as we went down this journey with our trust roadmap, I think one of the things we struggled with, certainly initially, was all of the data that was required to pull this together. And you'd think an accounting firm can, it's magic, right? No, it's hard. It's really hard because you need process and you need governance around the data. Because how do you know that the data you're collecting is accurate and complete, right? So we spent a lot of time internally trying to figure that out, and come up with processes to really provide governance around the data that we were reporting, making sure it was accurate. And one of the other things that we're looking at now is around our systems, because we've often found that what we report out, we kind of have like a sustainability team and then kind of our financial accounting team. But historically, and we see this a lot in client organizations, they don't speak to each other, right? So really having that integrated organization-wide approach to really drive governance around the data that you're reporting, because the last thing you want to do is put data out in the public domain and it not be accurate. Certainly in the capital markets side, we are seeing regulators becoming more interested in the data that companies are putting out when it comes to ESG. You have the SEC putting comments out, CPAB as well. And so, we are seeing this move towards more transparency, more accountability to stakeholders, but also having the regulators really look at that. So we are seeing a direction towards assurance, having that third party come in and really verify that your data that you're putting out is reasonable. I think investors are asking for that as well. And so that is something that certainly not all companies are ready for, particularly if, again, that sustainability and finance team aren't integrated, because certainly your accounting teams will be used to getting audited. I'm pretty sure the sustainability teams are not. And so having that integrated approach within an organization to really drive the ESG reporting agenda is really something that we're seeing, and we're helping a lot of clients get ready for that assurance, because it's not a matter of if assurance is coming, it's going to be when, because the regulators are asking for it, because so many stakeholders are relying on that information. So that's the journey we're seeing companies go down right now.
Can I add something to that? It builds on the assurance piece, the data quality, and a conversation that you and I were having before. So diversity, equity, and inclusion has been evolving. It's like, if you think about it as sort of a subject matter area, it's still pretty, I'd say it's sort of in its toddler phase, even though I've been working on it for a long time, but it's not like an entrenched area like tax or audit, like it's growing. And the challenge with that also is that sometimes it's hard to find what you should be doing and how you should be doing it, how you measure it. And that's why it's also important to why it's important to actually dedicate the right resourcing to manage these issues. I think organizations are starting to understand that it is a function that manages risk, engagement, trust. Like it hits on so many parts of your business, internally and externally, that you do have to ensure that you've got the right resources to support it, so that, putting out a number or putting out a statement now in sort of the world that we operate has risk attached to it. And you've got to be able to stand behind whatever you put out. And so if you're putting out goals or targets that you're looking to achieve, you better have a rock solid plan behind you to make sure that you're working towards achieving those goals, or else you're just opening yourself up to much more criticism from the same stakeholders that you're looking to appease. So that would be my one piece of advice on how to manage some of this, because it is an important area, and it is easy to fumble up on it because there isn't these roadmaps that have historically been entrenched within organization systems or even more broadly. So you've got to have some sophisticated people working and integrating within your business, not working in silos.
JP, maybe I can turn it over to you. And we know that businesses and companies weigh costs and benefits and risks in doing business, obviously, and diversity and sustainability are not borne by all people and communities equally. Perhaps you can address that paradigm and also provide some commentary on how you see businesses might move to a more even sharing of resources and impacts of inclusive sustainability.
Yeah, it's a big question, particularly when you throw that through. And a lot of the work that I do is in the Indigenous space. And we need, across cultures, you need to recognize the diversity within cultures itself, from socioeconomic, for aspirations. And the Indigenous community is no different. And often the folks at the table, often the folks that aren't at the table are not capitalized. They're the ones with the least amount of resources to get to the spaces that we need them. So when we think about, I'm going to just throw one other line. With the First Nations Major Project Coalition, came from the conference last year, one of the statements that came out, and it actually became the tagline for one of the reports, was all the path to net zero, just bringing in net zero, runs through traditional territories of Indigenous communities. And that statement is really powerful when you think about it, and then you overlay everything else. So going back to the capitalization about how do we bring more diversity to the table through the Indigenous lens, it really gets down to the capitalization. If we want true equitable partnerships, if we want stronger outcomes, faster regulatory, more certainty, and if we really care about the well-being of future generations of definitely the most impacted community in this country over time, then we got to find ways to get capital into communities. Now, there are plenty of really great examples in this country of getting capital to communities to be participants in projects, even at the public level, like the Clearwater deal in the East Coast, where the Mi'kmaq communities were able to raise over $500 million to become 50% equity stakeholders in the fisheries. And what's really interesting about that project, when you think about where we are in this history of Canada, just the previous year before this deal, the Mi'kmaq fishermen and women were being harassed. Their boats were being burned, their fishing traps were being burned, their shacks were being burned, all because of racists against our people who were fearful of what a moderate living means in our people. And then the next year, they have to sell their fish to the people that they were burning their boats. So think about where you are today and the ledger, what side of the ledger you want to be on. The most recent deal and the biggest one to date is the Enbridge deal, where we had 23 nations. And again, you got to understand the Indigenous nations are not a monolith. And even though the Indigenous term is the umbrella, you have Inuit, Métis, First Nation, there are power balance struggles between Métis and First Nations and Inuit, and so recognizing those things to be true. But the fact that the Enbridge deal was done in 5 months, about $1.2 billion on pre-existing 7 pipelines. The province came to the table with a backstop. RBC came to the table because the project was de-risked. Now, yes, of course, there's not project construction risk. There's not deal risk because there's already deal flow in the pipelines. But there are plenty of lessons to be learned around equitable or capitalization and equity participation of Indigenous communities. But that's the key to unlocking a lot of the challenges that many of our communities see, is that we're quite far behind the curve when it comes to participation in the economy. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we need to find ways to augment the diverse groups to make sure that they have seats at the table, all the way from scholarships to mentorship to to large capital pools to make sure that the communities can get there. But I'm excited here in Canada on what we're seeing these days, and the trajectory is like a hockey stick. It is going up quite rapidly, and it's complex and challenging, but the opportunities are incredible.
Those great examples. Maybe, Sandeep, you can talk about how businesses can move to, based on what JP was talking about, the sharing of, the more even sharing of resources and impacts, and how organizations can build transparency with respect to inclusive sustainability.
Sure. So I think the transparency comes in a number of different ways. I think one is through engagement, right? And I think with all the different stakeholders, I think the trust roadmap is a good example of that, where you've gone out to, in I guess in the mining industry, it would be with the key stakeholders that you would work with, whether it's the investors, community members, your employees, and understanding what is important to them when it comes to some of these issues and where they see that you've got some gaps. And then actually playing that back to them, right? Not sort of hiding from what the results are, and it doesn't have to be radical transparency. You don't need to say this is exactly, play back everything. But I think there is importance in sharing back, here's what our gaps are. And then it's not only identifying what the gaps are, but then having a solid roadmap for how you're going to work to address that, and acknowledging that the road to addressing that may be bumpy, and that you might end up taking a few steps forward and then a couple steps back, because these issues that we're talking about, if they were easy, they would have been addressed and we wouldn't be having this conversation. The reality is that a lot of these issues are complex. We're dealing with sort of human beings and a diversity within human beings. And so you've got to recognize that as long as you're showing good effort and progress and being transparent about that, I think that can go a long way in helping you manage these issues and building the trust that Kevin was talking about. But I think some transparency around that is key. The challenge that raises, and as a lawyer I know that, is that it sometimes creates risk. So you've got to sort of manage those. And that's why going back to my comment before, is you've got to put the right people around the table to start to address these issues with you. And I was on a call last year, actually, and actually throughout my career, I've had to sort of push back against legal teams a little bit to say, hey, I know that what we're, like even collecting data can cause some risk, right? And people are afraid to collect it because then it's like, oh, then we know what our problems are. But, I think when you look at the bigger picture is if we, don't know what our problems are and then we aren't addressing that, that poses more legal risk. And so being creative and understanding as a company, because companies take risks all the time, what risk is worth taking. And I would suggest that if you're not going to sort of move forward on some of the EDI pieces that are risk, you're going to face larger risks, more significant risks that'll have a broader impact to your business. And that's the conversation over the years that I've engaged in when I've sort of had to engage in conversations with legal teams when I face some resistance around this work.
So much of what you said just resonated. I wanted to pick up on the table idea of bringing people around your table. One of the keys to growth is being a little uncomfortable, always stretching yourself, right? So I don't know how many times I get asked. I live up north. I love it up in the north. I choose to live up there, and I get tired of being invited to Toronto and Vancouver. It's just I get invited all the time to speak in boardrooms, to meet with executives. And now I'm going, if you really want to understand the community, whether it's the Black North Initiative or one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever been in, and after the experience, my respect for, I already had a high level of respect for women. I have this incredible daughter that keeps me on the straight. But I attended this Indigenous Women's Network, and there's like 300 powerful Indigenous women. I was one of maybe 3 men in the audience. And I know the flip to that has been very true in many resource activities. But the important part of this story is that stretch yourselves, get out to community, get out to Black North Initiative, get out to these women events, and really understand. And now I'm getting, I like to the busy executives in the room or online, like, I know you're busy, but if you really want to understand the table, get out to our community. So I actually have this really cool fishing boat, and I don't know if you know this, or maybe I might have mentioned it a few times, but I love to hunt and fish. But it's one of the things that I love to do is to host people in a different setting, because that changes your perspective. We're going to have the same conversations in your boardrooms, but I tell you, having the experience in a community and seeing how we live, seeing how our connection to the land is so powerful and important, and these are all the issues you deal with in your boardrooms, come visit me. Come visit the communities. I promise you, we're not going to put you on a spit and cook you. We want your business. We want the partnerships. We want the activities with you so that we can build stronger communities with you. So get out of your boardrooms, get out of these cities and come and visit, because that's how you really understand diversity and the tables that you're trying to form.
So next board meeting in an ice fishing tent up north.
I'll host.
I'm thinking we'll hold the Fasken series up north next year. I'm not sure bringing the whole of PDAC up north might be a good thing. Thank you for sharing that with us. Kevin, maybe, we've talked about formulating and adopting ESG strategies and measuring those goals. Maybe you can comment on how resource companies may disclose, communicate, and sustain these measures and initiatives that may extend over years, perhaps decades, and at the same time remain flexible given the ever-changing landscape of ESG.
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think that disconnect between sustainability and finance is going to create issues for organizations. We late last year, our sustainability team did some benchmarking. We did what we call our ESG Insights report, where we looked at the sustainability reports for the top 250 public companies in Canada. And an interesting observation of that exercise was that there clearly was a disconnect between the sustainability reporting and the financial reporting. And as organizations, we really see that integrated reporting really being able to drive value, as I mentioned earlier. And so having those systems and processes in place today, or putting them in place, as sustainability reporting evolves over the years, which I'm sure it will, providing that framework and that grounding for how you collect your data, how do you ensure it's complete and accurate, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be really important, because what gets reported today is not going to be what gets reported 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because I think there's going to be more. There's going to be, as investors and as stakeholders, soak in all of this data that's being generated, not just here in Canada, but, globally, particularly in the EU, where, I think it's fair to say they're probably quite more advanced than we are here. There's going to be learnings. And so building the system and process today to be flexible enough to ensure that you can adapt as those reporting frameworks change is going to be really critical for companies to be able to drive that continued success around reporting going into the future.
I like Sandeep, your comment about toddlers. We're at the toddler stage, and perhaps, you're talking about the European Union, they're beyond the toddler, maybe into the teen stage, but it's still obviously a developing area, and it'll be continuing to develop over a long period of time. Sandeep, I'm going to come back to you again and ask you, how do we understand and meet millennials' expectations of what constitutes a diverse and inclusive workplace? Understanding, as we've heard today on this panel, that one size doesn't fit all. What does it mean for the sustainability for both businesses run by millennials and future generations? Again, sort of building on our thought of, what happens 20 years in the future or further.
So I think the first thing to sort of lay out, I think this generational divide has existed across generations. And so it's not like, all of a sudden we're dealing with it. I think organizations have been grappling with what happens when you've got multi-generations in the workforce. What's different, I think, is the context in which, well, say, millennials and Gen Zs have grown up. They have seen we've seen probably the most change in the last sort of 10, 15 years in terms of technological change and what that has meant for us being connected as humanity. And that's why we've seen sort of a lot of these social issues arising and becoming more forefront. And then we're also seeing this looming climate challenge that we have. And so there's a lot going on, and I think both the millennials and Gen Z have grown up in this milieu. If you think about it, they've always had technology. They've been they're very savvy on social media, and so their awareness around issues is much deeper than I think we as organizations have seen in the past when it comes to new entrants into the workforce. And that also means that they have higher expectations of workplaces, and I think they have less tolerance for sort of historically sort of conservative cultures. Some of the research shows that this cohort has grown up seeing their parents sort of give their lives to their careers, and they're like, that's not for us. That is not what we want. And so they've got a clear understanding of what they want from work and the expectations that they have of their employers. And many coming out of university have come from places that are much more sort of activist in environments that are much more accommodating. And so when they walk through our doors, that is what they expect from us. And then they're shocked when organizations haven't moved at the same pace as some of the other environments that they've been in. So it is imperative that we start to understand their expectations and look to manage them. But we also have to remember we've got a number of other generations in the workforce who have their own expectations around what they'd like to see. And so the conversation isn't just about them. I think it's a conversation about all of the generations and really around workplace culture. What is it that you're looking to create? How are you managing expectations? Going back to all of the things that we've talked about now, transparency, trust, they're all sort of critical to having these different people come and work together. And it's important. Like, we can't ignore the Gen Z millennial expectations because again, talking about long-term sustainability of your organizations, you need knowledge transfer, right? You're going to have people leave, more senior people starting to leave. You need people who understand your business. You need people who understand the expectations of consumers. And these are these folks. And so we've got, I don't have the answer about how you figure it out, but we've got to figure it out instead of, I think historically we've kind of said, oh, they'll learn the ways and, we'll get to where we need to be, because that's been the case. I think there has to be a bit more, if I say radical understanding of how and radical shifts on how these different generations learn to work together, or else you're not going to get, like I said, the knowledge transfer. You're not going to have a pipeline of talent to take on your leadership roles. And that ultimately will impact the viability and performance of your organization.
You can have the best project in the world with the best reserves, but if you don't have the people to actually develop the project, what good is that to you? So I think that's why getting that workforce strategy is really important, right?
That's right.
I was just going to say, so building on that theme, there's always an emphasis on that we should be looking for the best talent available. How do we reconcile that? And I'm just putting this out to the group generally. How do we reconcile that with diversity and sustainable development? Looking for the best talent available. Does anybody have any?
Yeah, I think like anything, if you want the best talent, you better have the best space to work, the best place to work. I mean, talent will go to where it's most appreciated. Talent will go to, like we were talking earlier about, wages. I mean, how that has, that's a big part of it too. Interesting debates around work-life balance. Trying to get people back into the offices. We were talking about that. If you want the best talent across the sectors or across the diverse groups, you've got to be the best actor, and all the things I think we've been talking about are the ingredients to attract talent. And in addition to trust and transparency, be genuine. Young people will sniff out the fakes. Be genuine in everything you do. Be intentional in everything you do. And you can't teach that in leadership. It's just you've got it or you don't. Yeah.
So I don't know if I understood the question differently, but I don't think there's a conflict, right? When you're talking about diversity, you are talking about getting the best talent. And I think we really got to look back and say, if we've got a room full of people who all look, act, and make decisions in the same way, is that really what good looks like, right? And the research shows that you need diversity, and that's diversity of thought, perspective, experience at the table, because that's what's going to get to better decisions. That's what's going to lead to better innovation. And so, and I've been saying this for years, sometimes what our definition of good is what we need to really understand and say, do we have the right definition of good? And then sort of look to hire or bring people in based on those definitions. So I don't think there's a conflict there, actually. I think diversity is the right decision. Like, that is what you need to in order to hire the best and the brightest.
Perhaps if more organizations look at that, Sandeep, from that perspective, then the excuse that often organizations use to say, well, we were looking for the best talent, will be overridden by exactly what you said. Yeah.
Well, I think it's challenging that assumption, which I think is inherent in the question, is that they are mutually exclusive, which I think what Sandeep is saying, and
right.
I would agree, is it's not. And so, certainly when, as we kind of did our trust roadmap, there were questions around targets and why do you have targets? And, my perspective on it was, I'm an accountant, so I love data, I love stats. And, I think if, certainly, the mining sector may be a little different than professional services, but if you look at the complement of our staff population, when it comes to gender, visible minorities, you expect that, at all levels of the organization, it should reflect the diversity of the population set that you're starting with. And so if I take it to mining in particular, look at gender, right? Like, that story I said earlier about how you have empty rosters because they couldn't have, or the women in the community didn't feel comfortable working for the organization because of the workplace culture. Like, that's a really big missed opportunity. So, I think there is no requirement to differentiate between best and kind of diverse individuals. It should naturally occur, just by way of statistics, in my view.
If I can said one, as you're talking, one movie came to mind, The Intern. Remember, it's De Niro, having the important, and why I got ahead, like, what is he talking about? So we're all in the mining sector, I assume, and we're talking about regulatory work. In the Indigenous community, having our elders, like a De Niro at the table, is really important. Having elder councils, and we talk about the intersection of traditional knowledge, and we were talking about at the very beginning, and with Western science, the best way, because they're two different worldviews, they often don't fit. It's just about creating the inclusive space for all systems to have conversations around the diversity of thought so that we can do better when it comes time. So more De Niro's at the table.
Maybe I will take a moment and open things up to our audience and ask if there are some questions that people would like to. I can always add more questions, but
Hello. Hello, good morning. I'm Manuel Barros from the Chilean law firm Keri. Many thanks to Fasken for this panel and the panel which we had a very interesting discussion. I have two short questions. The first one is to Jean-Paul. I understood that you're not a lawyer, so I would like to know what do you think is the most important contribution that a lawyer could do in the indigenous matters and challenges? And to Sandeep, a short question related to if you think that the lawyers have a role of educating and showing clients the opportunity that diversity have in case clients haven't seen the importance of this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. That is a really important question because, as we know, lawyers and accountants drive the world. The most important thing I think a lawyer can do when working with the Indigenous communities is don't let your value set get in the way of what the communities want. I see too often where, if we look around some major mining projects, I'll stay safe here in my safe place, where there's a lot of discourse. Lawyers pushing back and assuming what they think is right for the community versus what the community actually wants. And those values get in the way. And then to be very cognizant, there's a thing called the Indigenous economy. And I'm not talking about the Indigenous economy the way you're thinking about the Indigenous economy. It's the advisors and the lawyers that are benefiting from longer term cycles in resource development. And you're forgetting about the community needs and aspirations. So do your job. It's really important. Keep your values as far to the side as you can. Make sure Indigenous values, make sure you're in the communities to really understand and translate those forward.
So I'd probably build a little bit on that. I think ultimately so I'll speak because I've been on the lawyer side where I'm advising clients, but I've also been on the receiving side when I've been in corporates, receiving advice from lawyers when I'm trying to manage through different risk issues. I think ultimately, if you're a good lawyer, you understand your client's business, you understand what they're looking to achieve. And in order to do that, you need to understand all parts of their business. And that does include understanding and advising them where there may be opportunity or risk when it comes to EDI. So I do think as lawyers, you've got an opportunity there. I think it's also remembering the role that you do play is obviously to provide advice, is to provide legal advice. But if you better understand issues of EDI, your advice will be better because you will be able to either help your client mitigate things or take advantage of things. So just like anything else, the better you know your client, the better you know what they're looking to achieve, the better advice you're going to offer your client.
Hi. Oh, is it? Oh, yeah. Hi. Sam and Amir, legal counsel at Shared International. This question is for Sandeep. This has to do with how to mitigate risk once you disclose something that you're not necessarily required to, but you're essentially trying to bridge the gap to shareholders that, we're not doing great here. These are the gaps. So now from a legal compliance perspective, once it's out there, how would you advise, or maybe what have you seen in terms of mitigating that risk once you've kind of disclosed that information?
Yeah, so I think it depends, on the jurisdictions you're in. And so if you're in Canada, there's opportunities, depending on the province you're in, there's definitely, because a lot of this might raise human rights risks under human rights legislation. So there are special program exceptions that you can work with your lawyers, and we've got people who can help with some of that. But you'd want to make sure that you're falling under some of those exceptions to help mitigate some of that risk, because you've gotten the approval to say, we've developed a special program to deal with this particular gap. So it goes back to the response I had that if you're going to put out data and you're going to put out where you're trying to go, have a plan on how you're going to address that gap. And then, like I said, in different jurisdictions, there's just different opportunities to make sure under different legislation when you're disclosing that you've got exceptions around that. So I would understand that. But ultimately, I think if you're documenting and making sure that you're, again, doing something about the gap that you're disclosing, that helps mitigate some of the risk.
I think there's also an opportunity for internal audit to be involved, right? Because they're best placed to help your own data governance process. And so leveraging those internal resources you already have to really kind of take an independent view of what you're putting out there. And do we have all of the procedures in place to make sure that what we're putting out there from a risk perspective is mitigated? So that, that's perhaps another opportunity for you to engage internally.
Hi, Tori Davella from Tech Resources. This is a related question. So to segue, I think there's a lot of comfort and trust around providing disclosure around things like representation because it's inherently more aspirational. But what about those risks, as Sama asked? So in mining in particular, there's obviously been some disclosures, some regulated, some not, around sexual harassment. Do you have any cases or examples of how folks have done a good job of engaging their internal and external stakeholders around the disclosures that maybe we're not as comfortable with, or those risks and gaps?
So I would not be able to speak on that because I haven't sort of done enough research and have understood that appropriately. So I'd feel like I'd be providing an answer that's not well thought out. But I think it's a great question, and I think you're right. We're probably, especially in depending on the industries you're in, there is going to be this requirement to disclose on some of those things, and we've seen the attention and focus on issues of harassment only continue to rise. So perhaps that's something for us to take away for our future session.
Yeah, and just similar response here. In northern parts of our country, folks have heard of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I don't know for folks that don't know this, the Moose Hut, it is really raising awareness so that we can't stick our head in the sands. But it is a prominent issue in our communities, and how do we create a safe place? Because it's one of the big questions that communities will ask. In my First Nation as well, we have a lithium project right going through our reserve, and we're actually contemplating establishing a 250-person camp on our reserve. Community members are pushing back a little bit, like, well, camps have a horrendous record of what they do to women and girls, and a lot of people get harassed if you don't fit the mold. So I think that's a great follow-up conversation that needs some more time and data. Kevin, he really likes data.
Well, I was just going to say, I do know there are companies looking at doing internal kind of culture and workforce surveys. I guess we've had some examples of some companies publicly disclose their results, which I think, it's a good discussion point in the industry. But I think having that data to support because I think certainly an executive team has a good handle around the broader corporate strategy, but do they really kind of in the trenches understand what the frontline the frontline employees are feeling from a workforce safety perspective? And I think the one way to do that is to do surveys, do other sorts of exercises to gather data. Now, whether as a company you feel that that's something you want to go public with, that's again something to discuss with internal legal and internal audit maybe. But I think going through that exercise can at least give the executive team a good handle on, feeling the pulse. It's kind of like employee pulse surveys in a way, but particularly focused around workplace safety. I think mining companies have for the longest time, speak up culture around safety. It's embedded in every mining company. But is the same attention to detail around sexual harassment, bullying, is that present? I would argue maybe not as much as safety, but why shouldn't it be? So I think that's maybe a way to handle it.
The one thing I would say, if you're sort of feeling it more imminently, I think it's also working with sort of corporate communications on how you frame the message up, because the reality is if you're actually doing a good job with your harassment discrimination policy, let's say you've launched a new policy and you've done some training, the reality is you're going to see your cases go up, right? And so you need to be communicating appropriately to your stakeholders around why your numbers have gone up, and that's actually a good thing because that means people understand, and therefore any behavior that was not appropriate is now being managed versus just sort of lying under the radar. But again, it's the story and the narrative that you're telling to make sure that you continue to create trust with your stakeholders.
I was just going to say that also, I was just going to say that, as global corporate reporting standards change and increase, we're going to start seeing more of that as it relates to transparency and accountability and so on. And it'll be a developing, over many years, I think, a developing standard that we see. Sorry.
Good morning, Monica Ospino from Outrade. I would like just to add a little spice into what you guys, and there are a couple of things. Number one, I think that it will be very interesting if you make comments. Jean-Paul, you already make it one. The quality in planning for engagement defines the understanding of who should be represented. I just want to be fair in terms of we have communities in the world today due migration that are mixed. So you will find traditional communities coexisting with indigenous peoples, coexisting with new immigrants, and coexisting with the industry. The fair representation comes in the quality of the engagement and planning for that. So you will really know who should be sitting on the table. And I think companies are failing in doing that. Sometimes, and with all respect, that sometimes we go more around the consultation to indigenous peoples and ignoring the traditional communities that have been settled for 200 years. Probably it's not 500 and not a central land, but it's still 200, 300 years. It just make them have a voice on the table and being impacted. So it will be interesting to hear your comments on that. And the other piece around the transparency and disclosure and communication with the stakeholders and communities, I think that we have a valuable tool in the grievance mechanism. I have used it in most of my projects a lot around extending the quality of communication through that channel. But once again, the industry is going through sophisticated online technologies that, to be very honest, at the grassroots level doesn't resonate. And the anger escalates because they don't have a channel where they can bring the issues. And most probably might not be issues that related to the industry, but is the fact that I'm not listening. So once again, the quality of the engagement is not only in the stakeholder mapping. The quality of engagement is in understanding the representation of the peoples that you are impacting as the operation. Thank you.
It's there's a little bit of caliente sauce in there for sure. It's really interesting here in Canada. I mean, it's what's going to create the engagement and consultation. You don't get a pat on the back anymore for doing that's just table stakes. You do it or buzz off. I mean, that's just the way that is. It's the Indian Act that has put chief and councils into. My dad's Chief Mike. He's been chief for 12 years. He took an 8-year break and he's chief again. And, we have our elders council, our youth council that inform. Leadership across this country varies from outstanding to really struggling with governance. It's really interesting when we think about, say, the LNG project out to the coast last year with the Wet'suwet'en, because the Indian Act chiefs are the ones that have a certain amount of say on the reserve lands, but their territories is by the hereditary chiefs. And where that project failed with one portion of one community was recognizing the hereditary chiefs' role as land stewards and community leaders. So it is it can be incredibly challenging. I think the biggest challenge in this country is, we get a mine site, you'll have many overlapping communities. Like look at what's happening up in the Ring of Fire. I used to sit on the board of Noront, actually, when we were bought out by Andrew Forrest. The two communities that want that project to go forward are gung-ho. They're leading the environmental process on the road. They're being supported. That's going to help the Ontario government figure out what the budget is to get that done. And the federal government will hopefully come in and we'll have a project. But then we got one community that's downstream that has already done a ton of mining themselves, are now telling the other communities they can't mine. So that's hypocrisy in my mind. That's leveraging that. Is it, and I've been around the table for 30 years and I've been in community, I've worked for governments, I've worked for industry. Is that the community leveraging their territory to get something from that project? Or is that community really talking about environmental impacts way, way downstream after they've already done a bunch of mining? So we also have to decipher what the challenges are working with communities, linear projects, larger projects, overlapping territories. It is incredibly challenging in this country. And our regulatory process is very cumbersome, I think. And if we're to create certain, Canada keeps losing its competitive edge in the mining sector because we can't get it. It's going to be interesting to see how this new Ontario legislation is going to be received and rolled out. I can tell you a lot of communities are very upset with this one, but very caliente.
So I would just very quickly say that I would agree with all that you've said. I think what that means is, and I think when we talk about actual engagement, you're right. We can't have this narrow view is that it's only with particular groups. I think I think that speaks to really understanding who your stakeholders are as an organization. And part of how you actually better understand your stakeholders and their needs, including around communication and all of those, and even how to engage in those conversations with them, means you need to have people within your organization who actually understand those communities, or understand how to engage with diverse communities, and really come from a perspective of I always say around being curious. It's like not having blind spots. You asked the question about bias before. It's like we all show up with bias around how we approach certain work. And to get to some of the issues that you were talking about, you actually have to step back and say, well, how do I actually figure out who the stakeholders are here? What is the process by which I understand who I may need to consult with or engage with? What are the particular issues within this community, so that I can authentically engage, so that I build the trust that I need to operate in whatever community I need to. So it is a different way of looking at the issues that we've historically haven't. The caveat too is it requires more time, but it's also having the right people in your organization who understand how to do that.
Kevin, I was just going to ask you about, we talked about blind spots, about bias and so on. I know when PwC is doing the trust roadmap, that's one of the areas that they addressed. They looked particularly at blind spots. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think for our organization, I think one of the things we've definitely highlighted, and I don't think this would be a surprise to many in this room, is that we do, when it comes to workforce representation, both from a gender and a visible minority perspective, Indigenous as well, there's room for improvement. And so, interestingly, we had a conversation at our partners conference around bias and how all of us each have our own inherent biases. You're not a bad person because you have bias. But I think one of the things we're having conversations around is being able to understand that you do have that bias, recognize it, reduce the impact, and leverage that so that going into a conversation or going into a board meeting, that to have that trigger go off when you do recognize that inherent bias coming through, and being able to mitigate the impact of that as part of your conversation. So we've got a number of programs internally around education, particularly around this bias point. We're trying to get that more spread within the organization, because I think one of the challenges we have is you're not going to fix diversity and inclusion challenges overnight. You need that roadmap to get to your aspirational, if it's 50-50 gender representation at all through the organization. But I think it's forced a conversation which, to be quite honest, isn't necessarily comfortable. but it's a necessary one, because going back to talent retention, if we don't provide an environment where our staff feel they can succeed and progress through an organization, they're not going to stay. And so, mining companies certainly have the same challenge when it comes to the next generation of leaders. You have to make those opportunities appetizing for that next generation to come in to work at site, to work their way up the ranks, to start as a haul truck driver, to move up into general manager positions and eventually executive levels. And if they don't see themselves represented in those higher levels of the organization, they're going to leave. And we are seeing that as a challenge from a retention perspective. So we're working really hard to try and address that. And I certainly think mining companies are no different, because there are many other opportunities for our young folks to they like the sexy Googles and the Amazons of the world. Mining's a different place, but so important to our country. We're not going to have all those electric vehicles built if we can't develop those mines here in Canada. And so we need these people to really embrace the industry. And so providing that environment where they feel they can succeed is such an important thing for us to tackle as an industry. And if we get this right, it's certainly going to continue to make mining an attractive employer for folks in this country.
I've heard so many times that it's important to be uncomfortable, and that's how we grow and learn, and within all segments of our.
Morning. Thanks very much, Dave Fournier with Global Affairs Canada. This has been very, very enlightening. I really like the one line, JP, I think you said, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. I've usually said it the other way around. What gets measured gets done. And being kind of a fellow data nerd myself, I'd be very interested to get your perspective on what should companies, what should we really be, what are the goals that we should really be trying to measure and to capture beyond the typical metrics of proportionality? Well, we got 50% women, 50% men, 10% South Asian, 5% racialized. Are there metrics outside of that we should be really capturing as an organization? And which ones have you found have really helped measure that trust element that you referred to before? Like, how can you, trust is so intangible, how can you really measure it? So I'd be really interested to get your perspective on that.
I'll kick off and then pass to you. I think what we did internally was we spent a lot of time trying to understand what do our stakeholders expect from us. So I think having like the laundry checklist of, here's the 20 things we need to report on, that wasn't the approach. We actually had conversations with our stakeholders and said, what do you measure us against when it comes to trust? So, the traditional audit quality, independence, like the kind of nerdy accounting stuff. But we spent a lot of time up front really understanding from our stakeholders' perspective what their perspective was, because it doesn't really matter what we think, it's what our stakeholders think. So I think it doesn't really answer your question, but I think spending that time up front in the communities and understanding what they will measure you against is a really important part of figuring out what you should then report on. And then I think it's also having the courage to, once you've come up with those metrics, not just reporting the good ones. Like, that's the easy part. The ones where you have challenges, but not just the ones where you have challenges, but the program or the initiatives you're putting in place to address those challenges and the story you tell around that journey is so important, because I think, nobody's perfect. Everyone realizes that, but I think being able to look your stakeholders directly in the eye and say, here's where we need to improve and here's our plan to get there, I think is the most important part. So I don't know, JP, anything to add? Or
I can add some more sort of specific things that you can start to collect or report on internally, at least within your leadership teams, to help you understand how you're progressing on some of these things. So representation, sort of proportionality is important. I think looking at things like your hire rates across the different levels of your organization, looking at attrition rates to see, and then cutting them by different demographic groups to see, are you losing more people of particular groups than others? Because that then raises questions. Looking at promotion rates, between different groups to see, as an organization, are you more likely to promote certain groups than others, and then asking the question around why that is. Many of you probably already do engagement surveys. Again, cutting those by different demographic groups to understand, are engagement levels different for different groups, and then asking yourself why that is, I think, is a good place to start if you haven't already been doing that.
Yeah, the only other couple things that just going to build on the engagement surveys and the happiness indexes, right? Also, just looking at the participation rates of those going through time, do you have a more engaged workforce? And then on Kevin's point around, do people feel safe in the organization to bring dissenting views forward, complaints? Do those numbers start to go up? Because then that's actually a double-edged indicator in a sense, but they feel comfortable and safe to bring their views forward. It's about feeling safe in a place and supported.
We are getting close to the end of our session here, so I will take a minute. Does anybody have any closing remarks they'd like to make before I close?
Yeah, I do actually.
Excellent.
I woke up, I think it was last week or the week before, and I was feeling like in a really feisty mood. And my friends and colleagues that know me know that I'm not too shy. And I was wearing my Deadly Uncle, the Res Life shirt, and I was feeling, okay, what am I gonna put out here today? And I don't usually do social. I felt like Rick Mercer doing this social media rant, and I posted all across my links because I'm thinking about my nephews and my nieces and my daughter. And the whole idea, the concept of economic reconciliation in this country, I still feel like Canada's dragging their feet. It's like, oh, it's just something we have to do, right? Because of all the things we're talking about. But know that economic reconciliation is Canada's edge. Because when we talk about equity, that is a form of consent with communities, if we can capitalize our communities. When we think about regulatory, I've already talked to you about having the Indigenous voice at the table. That's going to help us get through the regulatory processes in your mining projects quicker. And then the workforce. Empowering that Indigenous workforce is going to provide longer-term security and certainty for companies. So when anybody talks to you about economic reconciliation, you go, that's our edge. That's how Canada is going to get through the weeds, because we're stuck in the weeds right now.
I want to take just a moment to thank Kevin, Sandeep, JP for all your great insights today. It really has been a pleasure talking with you. You've really put a lot of great information out there and a lot of questions, things for the audience, both here and online to think about. It's really been a great discussion. Before I sign off, I have closing remarks that I have to make here. I encourage you all to click on the survey button the video player has to complete our event survey. That's clearly for the people online. And we welcome your feedback and are always interested to hear what topics you'd like us to present in the future. Also, a plug for our next session. Our next session in the 2023 Fasken PDAC series will be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how it has affected international mineral markets, national security implications for Canada. Taking place later today at noon Eastern Time. For those in Toronto, you're welcome to join us in person if you're able to, of course, or virtually. You can sign up for any of our upcoming sessions at the Fasken Institute section of fasken.com. We hope that you'll be back for additional sessions, and thank you all for coming today and being here in person and online. It's been a real pleasure.